keep an eye on you, Priscilla. That's what I mean. I was kidding. Feels better to be down here. I have to say, these past few weeks of rest have really been good for my mind and my body, and my soul. I'm really thankful for this congregation, for the congregation at Tracyton, for supporting that time away and continuing the ministries of the church when I'm not here, because the ministries of the church don't stop when the pastor's out of town, right? You got it. In my time off, I really enjoyed catching up on some recreational reading, something I haven't done in quite a while. Graduate school will do that to you. It'll kind of burn you out on reading. But I got a Kindle recently, and honestly, I think I've read more books in the last 6 months than I have in the last 6 years. In particular, I've enjoyed reading a crime thriller series by a local Kitsap author named Dee Black. His stories take place around Kitsap, and it's kind of fun to read about places I see and interact with every day. The current one that I'm reading, The Murder Mystery, takes place just over in Tracyton, right by the church, actually. Don't read into it or anything, but it's kind of fun to read about Tracyton. Being that these books are crime thrillers, if you're familiar with the genre, Dee Black is par for the course in that keeps you guessing as to who done it or what explains the mysterious circumstances in the book. He gives clues along the way, some breadcrumbs, but it's not until the final few pages that you finally start to understand the entirety of the story you've been reading. And I think this, in part, is what makes the ending of a story impactful. The final pages of a story do more than just conclude the series of events. They reinterpret. They give meaning to everything that came before, and details that once seemed incidental suddenly matter. Questions that have lingered in uncertainty begin to find their resolution. This idea was intriguing to me. So I began looking into it a little bit more. And I learned that some literary theorists, and if I'm wrong, Noli, you don't have to tell anybody, as one of the literary theorists in the room, they sometimes describe this as the recency effect, which is our tendency as humans to allow the ending of a story, which is the part we've read most recently, get it? To leave a strong imprint on how we understand the whole. The last bit of the story we read is the most impactful part. Now, if this is indeed true, which you can ask Noli later if it is or not, at the end of Luke's, if it is indeed true, it means that when we come to the close of the gospel stories, not just Luke's, but any of the four, it means that we ought to pay careful attention. Because here, Luke is not simply wrapping up a series of events, but he's giving us the lens through which we ought to read the entire gospel. And that lens, it's not a secret, the lens is resurrection. That is the lens through which we interpret the entire gospel story. The scene that we encounter here in the last few verses of Luke's gospel, the scene is chaotic. The scene is noisy. The disciples are still in Jerusalem, having been there for the Passover festival. And even though it's been 3 weeks for us since Easter, this story takes place on the first day of the week, on the day of resurrection. So it may seem like Easter was eons ago, but for our story, it's still right there, okay? The disciples are in Jerusalem. We can imagine that they are confused. We can imagine that they're scared. We can imagine that there is perhaps yelling and talking over one another, like at your family Thanksgiving dinner, perhaps, as they try to make sense of their varied experiences. Now, in the ancient world, when a charismatic Messiah-like figure amassed a bunch of followers, kind of like how Jesus did, there were usually 2 ways that it went when they died, and they always died, usually by purpose. There are 2 things that happened. One, the movement would end. Guess, they weren't who they said they were. Oh well, all good. Or two, the movement would appoint a new leader and they would try to carry the mantle. Well, we're sad about that guy dying, but hey, his brother's, looks like him and is just as nice. Let's try to keep things going. The written historical record suggests that those are the two ways that these movements either continued or not. But that's not what happened with the movement that Jesus initiated. First, we hear of the women who arrived at Jesus' tomb. They encounter the empty tomb, they encounter the angels, and they go and tell the disciples, but they brush it off as nonsense. And then, according to John's gospel, Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, they have their own account, their own experience that's added to the pool of meaning, and they're trying to figure it out. Last week, Reverend Mark shared about the story of Cleopas and his companion who returned from Emmaus with the news that they too had recognized the resurrected Jesus in the breaking of the bread. So there's all these different glimpses, all these different stories coming into the pool of meaning, and they're trying to sort it out, and they feel both hope that Jesus maybe isn't dead, but they also feel fear. Fear, not because Luke tells us. Luke's story is notably devoid of that detail, but if we are good readers of Scripture and we include John's gospel, which says in verse 19, on the evening of the first day of the week, Sunday, while the disciples were behind closed doors because they were afraid of the Jewish authorities, Jesus came and stood among them. I want to pause and take note of this precise moment where Jesus comes to the disciples. A moment where grief and fear are felt at the same time, where a noisy and disorderly group of people are confused and frustrated, where they're afraid for their own lives. Jesus appears just like that. So whether you're reading Luke, whether you're reading John or Mark or Matthew, who don't mention a locked room, the emotional reality of the shared gospel witness is the same. These are a people who are on edge. It's not hard to believe. They've lived betrayal, arrest, violence, and execution in the span of a long weekend. And they know what happens to movements like theirs. You remember Peter, whom on the night Jesus was betrayed, was asked 3 different times, weren't you an associate of that guy? Not me, he says, because he knows the cost of that association. More on that either next week or the week after. So make no mistake. It might be Easter morning in the story, and we might associate Easter morning with good things. But fear has settled into the disciples' bodies in a profound and visceral way. And fear, first century or 21st century, fear has a way of making us seek shelter. When the world feels unstable, we look for something to secure us, don't we? We retreat into familiar spaces, familiar people. We secure what we can. We close the doors behind us, sometimes locking them, hopefully to regain a measure of control in what is an increasingly chaotic world. I don't think this instinct is foreign to us, is it? We know what it's like to live in an anxious time. We know what it's like to fear political upheaval, economic roller coasters that make you lose your lunch, violence that has apparently become the new normal, social division, loss of life, loved ones, loss of livelihoods. I can't name precisely the weight that you carry with you today, but I am cautiously confident that we all know what it's like to hide behind a locked door. Our routines, ideologies, assumptions. Now, I understand that their situations vary, and you're thinking of situations, well, it's okay for me to be locked behind that door. I get you. I can't speak to every single nuance that occurs in your daily life, but I will say this. So much of what troubles me about our world today can be traced back to people retreating behind doors, massive doors, doors that were maybe once built to protect the vulnerable but have now been treated as though they were never meant to open again. And this temptation to dwell behind locked doors, it's alluring, whether you're in a position of power or not. But the thing about locked rooms, they don't remove the fear that we feel. They only contain it. They only give it a space to exist. It's in this moment for the disciples where the story of the resurrection becomes real. It is in that world where a world that loves to seek security over peace, a world that loves to seek security behind locked doors, that the risen Christ comes to them in wounded flesh to speak peace, to open their minds, and to send them as an embodied witness that God's love is stronger than death. Those three things are the important bits here, by the way. That Jesus speaks peace, opens our minds, and sends us as an embodied witness to God's love. So allow me to walk through step by step how Jesus leads the disciples in those three things. What is the first thing Jesus says when he appears through the door? Well, we don't know he appears through the door. Who knows? Maybe just smashed through the wall like the Kool-Aid man, if anybody remembers those commercials. The first thing Jesus does when he appears to calm his disciples' anxious hearts is to say, "Peace be with you." And when he says this, Jesus is not just telling them to calm down, take a breath, drink some water. We know that advice is never helpful when somebody's not doing well. Just calm down, take a breath. No, in Luke's gospel especially, the gift of peace is a characteristic of Jesus' ministry that is used multiple times throughout the story. In this sense, Jesus saying, "Peace be with you," is the most Jesus thing he could ever say. And Jesus is wanting to reassure the disciples that he is there with them. It's the first way that Jesus begins to settle the fearful hearts of his friends. But wait, you say. The fear that the disciples felt for their own political persecution, that's only part of the story. What really seems to cause them to be terrified is that they think they're seeing a ghost. A very astute observation. I'm glad you brought it up, because you're right. They are terrified when they see somebody that they thought to be dead, whom in the ancient world, the only plausible option in their mind was that ghost. Now, we ought not imagine this reaction is an ignorant one. I'm guilty of this as well, thinking that ancient folks are ignorant of most things that we take for granted. And yes, they didn't know about modern science and things like that, but they knew as well as we do that people don't rise from the dead. Remember, when a charismatic Messiah-like figure who amassed a large following was killed, there were two options. The movement dies along with them, or they choose another leader and keep it going. There wasn't a secret third option. We'll just claim he rose from the dead and keep the party going. That's not a thing. Something different was happening. As much as we might want to criticize the disciples for believing, all the times Jesus told them, hey, this is what will happen. The Son of God must die and da-da-da-da-da. He told them multiple times. We can criticize them, but we should be careful. After all, the disciples are us and we are them. And we know how fear and grief, especially when mixed together, can alter our decision-making. Fear, grief, especially when they're mixed together, they lead us to retreat behind those massive, insulated doors where we can conveniently lock ourselves inside. But minds cannot be opened when they're trapped by fear. So Jesus continues to assure his friends that he's not a ghost and they ought not be afraid. He says, look at my hands, look at my feet, look at the marks of my wounds. Eat with me. Another example that Jesus is an embodied person there with them. Ghosts don't eat. It's not the ghosts I'm aware of. I love that Jesus eats with them, not only because it suggests and confirms that this is Jesus the person, but we know all too well when we are struggling with grief, it can be hard to remember to take care of ourselves, to simply remember to eat, to drink. That's probably why Methodists are so well known for their potluck love and care. It's something, when somebody dies or something traumatic happens, we don't know often how to speak to people, but we know how to make a casserole. So Jesus eats with them, I think, in part so that the disciples will also eat. And as the disciples' fear turns to joy, as their bellies and hearts are filled with all manners of good things, it is then and only then that Jesus can open their hearts and their minds once more to the scriptures that he spoke about to them time and time again. And the kernel of the good news that Jesus says is that his resurrection must be preached to all people and to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. Now, do you remember where I told you the disciples were hiding behind locked doors? Open book quiz. Anybody with me on this? Where are the disciples? Jerusalem. They're in Jerusalem. They're in the place where Jesus says the good news must begin. Jesus, are you sure that doesn't start with the people like over there in Bethlehem or Galilee? Could we wait till things cool down in Jerusalem a little bit? Because there was some pretty violent opposition to your message just 3 days ago, and you're saying now that it starts with us and it starts here. Usually that would be the response of the disciples. That's the response of the disciples throughout the majority of the story. But here at the ending, the disciples are ready. Finally, after all of this time, the disciples are ready to come out from behind their locked doors and carry this mantle of peace proclamation that Christ has brought to them and to the rest of the world. Friends, don't miss how remarkable this is. In the matter of just a few moments in this story, the disciples go from prioritizing security over peace to now being willing to risk that security for the sake of peace. This makes me remember Dorothy Sowell. I believe that's how I pronounce her last name. She was born in Germany in 1929 and grew up during the years of the Nazi rise to power. Later in life, her writings were theological reflections on coming to grip with the horrors of the war, horrors that her heritage of Christian faith had not only failed to stop, but indeed aided in ensuring their success. In her essay, Peace, Not Security, she challenges the innate human desire to feel secure from any and all possible threats. She writes, and I have this on you got it, Tom. She writes, "You do not need to build any walls to hide behind. You can live without armaments. Because you are strong, you can put the neurotic need for security behind you. You do not need to defend yourself like a lunatic. For the love of the poor, Jesus says you can give life away and spread it around. The mechanism that runs its course from weakness to a need for security to violence is unsound. God is in you. You do not need to protect yourself. It is possible to live without violence and without weapons." Now, let me be clear. Sowell is not saying, I don't think she is saying, that personal or collective safety is not important or that we should live recklessly. No, wear your seatbelt when you go home today. Let's look beyond that reaction just for a moment. We likely could all agree that hiding behind locked doors wherever and wherever they are, they may help us feel secure as an individual, as a church, as a nation, but no matter how secure we think we are still left with our fears and our mistrust. This is how Dorothy and we too ought to understand how the risen Christ comes in wounded flesh to speak peace, to open our minds and then send us as embodied witness of peace to a world that idolizes security. I've been saying a lot of words, but church, this gospel asks a very simple question of you today. Are you able to let go of your desire to be secure, whatever that may look like? Are you able to let go of your desire to be secure, whatever that may look like? I'll offer one sign of hope towards an answer of yes to this question. It's been a number of years now, but I do remember a televised news report of two women who were 9/11 widows. They lost their spouses in the attack. Grateful for the outpouring of support that they received, they started thinking about the women in Afghanistan who they were told they ought to hate because of their nationality and their religion, but who, when widowed, Afghani women lose their status in that society and therefore find an already difficult life even harder. These two women moved to compassion and raised money and formed a foundation called Beyond the 11th to support Afghani widows, and even made visits to Afghanistan to meet the widows they were helping when other nations were sending tanks and bombs and guns. For them, these connections helped to make sense of a world that worships security on the altar of human lives. And I suggest that in doing so, they model for us the gift, and it is a gift from God, of being released from what we fear and moving towards open and understanding minds and hearts. Perhaps reclaiming this ancient practice of hospitality for the stranger, as Jesus taught, I remind you, is what will lead us to our true home, where indeed all nations can be at peace. May it be so, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.